115 BC. At the fortress of Merv, the eastern bastion of the Parthian Empire, two silent, massive forces stood face to face across the desolate barrens east of the oasis city. Arrayed to the east were thousands of cavalrymen from the Yuezhi. Once nomads of China's northwest, they had been driven into the western deserts by the rising Xiongnu. Here they had conquered Bactria, the Hellenistic successor state founded by the descendants of Alexander the Great, and re-established themselves as a formidable power dominating Western Central Asia. Though they lacked grand capitals or a mature agrarian civilization, they grew wealthy by exacting heavy transit tolls from passing merchant caravans. At this moment, their signature horse archers and light step cavalry stood in loose, restless formations. Their spirited Central Asian steeds seemed incapable of stillness. Warriors had their arrows notched, eyes fixed warily on the enemy to the west. To the west stood 20,000 Parthian horsemen. By this time, the Parthian Empire, over a century old, was at the zenith of its power. After winning independence from the Seleucids and repeatedly defeating the greatest successors of Alexander, they had, under the legendary Mithridates II, conquered all of Mesopotamia, modern Iraq, annexed Armenia, and pushed their borders to the Euphrates. Yet the Yuezhi, migrants from the Far East, had become a persistent threat on Parthia's eastern flank. Between 128 BC and 124 BC, two successive Parthian kings, Phraates II and Artabanus I, had fallen in battle on this eastern front. To the empire, this was a stain of profound shame and loss. Now the 20,000 Parthian riders stood in disciplined ranks bordering the Merv oasis. They exuded a level of order far beyond that of the steppe nomads. Even the light Parthian horse archers stood in tight, ready formations. Most formidable were the cataphracts, men and horses clad in heavy scale armor, clutching long lances, staring coldly at the taunting, circling nomads across the plain. They were a coiled spring, waiting for the command to launch a lethal charge. But not today. Not here. A long, low blast of a horn echoed from behind the Yuezhi lines. The Yuezhi forces slowly parted, carving a passage through their ranks. Through the swirling dust, a peculiar procession emerged. The group was small, but their attire was a spectacle the Parthian soldiers had never seen. Leading them were mounted warriors clad in red and black lacquered armor, hoisting grand banners of black borders on red fields. They carried more ceremonial regalia than weapons. Surrounded and protected by these guards were a dozen civilians in uniform robes. At their head was a man cradling a long wooden staff, adorned with strange rhythmic tufts of yak hair. In the haze of the desert dust, this decorated staff was clearly of supreme importance. The entire party clustered around it, as if it were the physical embodiment of power and sovereignty. This strange envoy moved in silence. They exited the Yuezhi lines, crossed the empty no-man's land, and approached the Parthian wall of steel. The Parthian horns responded. As if rehearsed, the impenetrable line of shields and horses opened a gap, swallowing the advancing party into the safety of the empire. Another long horn blast sounded from the Yuezhi. They turned their horses and vanished into the shimmering heat haze and desert dust. The Parthian army stood down. They shifted their formations, flanking the newly arrived guests, and began the march westward. Their military band even began to play melodies tinged with Hellenistic influence. This was the first time an official Chinese diplomatic mission had ever set foot on Iranian soil. The dream of the Eastern giant to reach the West had taken its first solid step. Over the next 2,100 years, this scene would be reenacted time and again, continuing even today under a new name, the Belt and Road. This party, so alien to the Parthian soldiers, was the formal embassy sent by the Han Empire. That wooden staff was the jie, the imperial tally of authority. In the Han system, it represented the person of the emperor himself. Guarded by 20,000 elite Parthian cavalry, the Han envoy would travel over 800 kilometers further west, a journey of at least a month to reach their final destination. Hekatompilos, the city of 100 gates, the capital of the Parthian Empire, located near modern-day Damgan in northeastern Iran. If measured from Chang'an, the Han capital, this diplomatic odyssey spanned over 7,000 kilometers, with a one-way travel time exceeding 10 months. Such a feat of diplomacy was an immensely costly and perilous undertaking, even for superpowers of the scale of the Han and Parthian empires. Why do it? Let us look north of China and turn back the clock nearly a century. In 200 BC, Liu Bang, the founder of the Han Empire, was besieged by rebels and the Xiongnu at Baideng Mountain. Though he narrowly escaped, for the next 60 years, the Han Empire remained in a state of absolute strategic passivity. Even during the rule of Wen and Jing, a golden age of internal prosperity, the empire could only endure Xiongnu raids through strategic matrimony, hechin, and calculated restraint. Han expansion to the north was effectively locked behind the Great Wall. At that time, Chang'an lacked not only quality horses, but also a clear perception of the outside world. Under the Xiongnu blockade, the Han people had no idea what lay beyond the Kunlun Mountains and the vast deserts they called the Western regions. Beyond that undulating wall, the Xiongnu, masters of the steppe, were at their peak under Modul Chanyu and his successors. To the fledgling Han Dynasty, the Xiongnu were more than just border raiders. They were a massive pincer, choking the throat of Chinese civilization from the east, north, and west. Until a young, ambitious man took the throne, Emperor Wu, Liu Che. Initially, Emperor Wu knew nothing of Iran or Parthia. His gaze was fixed on a people who had been routed by the Xiongnu, the Yuezhi. The logic of history is often theatrical. He sent envoys to find the Yuezhi, whose king's skull had been turned into a drinking cup by the Xiongnu, to persuade them to launch a counterattack from the west. The plan was a pincer movement, the Han from the east, the Yuezhi from the west, to sever the right arm of the Xiongnu. It was a grand strategic vision, but in execution, it became a decade-long saga of disappointment. When the Han envoy finally broke through Xiongnu blockades, crossed the Pamir Plateau and entered Central Asia, they found the Yuezhi, but the envoy discovered that these former nomads were now settled and prosperous in the lush Hellenistic lands of Bactria. They had no desire to return to the blood-soaked steppes of East Asia. The mission for a military alliance had failed. However, the envoy brought back a new world. he told Emperor Wu, "At the edge of the western regions, west of the Yuezhi, lies a great power called Anxi, Parthia. They have thriving cities, elite cavalry, and rare treasures from Mesopotamia." This was the first time the Iranian plateau appeared on the horizon of a Chinese ruler. As modern people, we enjoy the seamless convenience of air and sea travel. This might prompt a question. Why was China so determined to push west? Why Iran? Why, at every peak of its national power, does China instinctively cast its gaze toward that high plateau? In the context of history, this was never a question. It was an inevitability. From a geopolitical perspective, the Iranian plateau is the waist of the vast landmass known as the World Island, Eurasia. It functions as a titanic crossroad. To the north lie the Caucasus and the Caspian Sea. To the south, it strangles the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean. To the west, it offers a level path into the Mediterranean civilization circle. For the Han Empire, pushing westward was a survival-driven choice. First, it was a strategic breakout. With the Xiongnu occupying the north, the only way to outflank them geopolitically was to open the west. This concept of severing the Xiongnu's right arm remains a classic paradigm for China to break through geopolitical encirclement. Second, it was value creation. The flow of silk, porcelain, and spices defined the distribution of wealth in the ancient world. Whoever commanded the trade routes to the Iranian plateau held the financial pulse of ancient globalization. For any ambitious Central Plain dynasty, the East was bounded by the vast Pacific, insurmountable by the technology of the time. To the north lay the unconquerable wandering wilderness of the steppe. To the south were primordial rainforests guarded by toxic mists and jagged mountains. Only the west offered a two-way pursuit between great civilizations. Thus, from the dawn of his reign, Emperor Wu began plotting an overland lifeline to Iran to ensure the flow of silk, goods, horses, and spices. Relying on two genius generals and the immense wealth accumulated by his predecessors, he launched a series of high-intensity, reckless, and large-scale campaigns against the Xiongnu. Finally, the Han seized the He corridor, prying open the gateway to modern-day Xinjiang and Central Asia. But this was only the beginning. To ensure this fragile trade line wasn't severed by Xiongnu remnants, the Han Empire embarked on the most ambitious infrastructure project of the ancient world. They extended the Great Wall from the banks of the Yellow River deep into the desert. In the wasteland known as the Sea of Death, a dense network of beacon towers and relay stations formed a hyper-efficient intelligence system. If a caravan arrived or an enemy moved, signal fires, the wolf smoke, would race back to the capital Chang'an at incredible speed. As the Han vanguard pushed further, the distance between the Han and Parthian empires shrank. By 115 BC, the moment described at the beginning of our story, the Han had established a fragile but stable international order east of the Pamirs. Most importantly, they had forged the Northern Silk Road from Chang'an to Parthia. This artery for commerce and war stretched from China's heartland through Xinjiang and Central Asia onto the Iranian plateau. Yet we must recognize the geopolitical fragility of this northern route. Even with the protection of the Great Wall, the northern path was a gamble against climate and luck. Caravans had to traverse hundreds of miles of salt flats, endure the extreme aridity of the Taklamakan Desert, and scale the Pamir Mountains, which average over 4,000 meters in altitude. For every horse that reached the Parthian capital of Hecatompylos, 10 might have fallen along the way. Every roll of silk traded for gold in Parthian markets was soaked in the sweat of soldiers and artisans. Economically speaking, it was a brutally expensive venture. Was there another way? In fact, while the Han envoy was in Bactria, he discovered more than just news of Parthia. In the bustling local markets, he stumbled upon an unbelievable sight. Merchants selling specialties from his own home in the Xiongnu plain, Shu cloth, Sichuan silk, and Qiong bamboo staves, square bamboo canes from Qionglai. When the Han envoy pressed the merchants on their origin, the Bactrians replied, "We buy these from Xiongnu, ancient India, thousands of miles to the southeast." Merchants from Shu traveled there specifically for trade. 2 millennia later, archaeologists at the Sanxing Dui site in Sichuan and the Dian Kingdom sites in Yunnan unearthed vast quantities of ivory and cowrie shells. They even found shell storage vessels, bronze containers used to hold cowrie shell currency. These vessels were filled with shells harvested from the Maldives in the Indian Ocean. This stunning fact proves that long before the Han Empire attempted to carve a path through the northern deserts, private Sichuanese caravans had already braved uncharted jungles and mountains. They brought eastern goods to the Ganges River basin, where Indian middlemen eventually transported them to Persia and Central Asia. Conversely, Western culture and commodities flowed back through this multi-stage relay into southern China. As a monarch of profound strategic vision, Emperor Wu immediately realized the significance of this southern route. It meant bypassing the fierce Xiongnu and Qiang nomads and extending imperial influence directly to the rim of the Indian Ocean, establishing direct contact with the wealthy ancient states of the West. Thus, a national project titled The Development of the Southwestern Tribes was officially launched. The geography of southern China is a world apart from the north. This is the heart of the Hengduan Mountains, where massive rivers like the Jinsha, Lancang and Nu have carved bottomless canyons into the earth. Snow-capped peaks and malaria-infested jungles formed a natural barrier. As early as the Qin Empire, Qin Shi Huang had ordered the construction of the famous 5-foot road to consolidate control over the south. It was so named because the path hewn into the vertical cliffs was a mere 5 feet wide. Lacking modern tools, ancient artisans used a primitive yet brilliant method: thermal fracturing. They would heat the stubborn rock with massive fires until it glowed red, then douse it with cold water. The sudden thermal shock would cause the stone to shatter, allowing them to refine the path inch by inch with iron chisels. In Yunnan today, we can still see the remains of this ancient road. The deep rows of hoof prints worn into the rock are time markers left by countless pack horses over thousands of years. During the Han Dynasty, Emperor Wu expanded this network further. He dispatched armies and envoys into the southwest, using diplomacy and engineering to integrate scattered tribal paths into imperial highways. However, objectively speaking, even with the full weight of the state machinery, the terrain remained unconquerable. The Han Empire, despite its greatest efforts, could not complete a viable southern land artery stretching from Sichuan through Yunnan and Burma into India and finally Iran. Indeed, as late as World War II, the route from Burma into Yunnan remained a logistical nightmare, even for mechanized modern Allied forces. Thus, while the Han Empire exerted tremendous effort, the southern route to Iran remained a relay-style private trade network under the technical conditions of the time. It could not become a strategic corridor for massive troop movements or heavy transport. This is why Emperor Wu's conquests eventually halted at the borders of Vietnam, rather than pushing further into the treacherous southwest. 2,000 years later, as we look back from the vantage point of today's global landscape, we find that nearly half the world's population was once concentrated within two titans, the Han Empire and the Roman Empire. Positioned precisely in the center sat the Parthian Empire, masterfully holding the balance. The Han Empire's economic foundation rested upon tens of millions of independent smallholders. The state sustained its vast bureaucracy and military expenditures through sophisticated financial levers, such as the state monopolies on salt and iron. In contrast, the Roman Empire's economy relied more heavily on Mediterranean maritime trade and the massive slave labor estates known as latifundia. This fundamental difference was reflected in their attitudes toward the Silk Road. While the Han Empire yearned to project sovereign power and secure elite warhorses through northern and southern routes, Rome suffered a massive drain of gold and silver due to its obsession with silk. An obsession so extreme, it sparked fierce debates in the Senate over moral decay. Within this system, the northern and southern routes of the Han Empire played starkly different roles. The northern route served the state, the military, and centralized authority. It was a form of sovereign power projection that transcended mere economics. The southern route, however, was driven by the people. The trade conducted by commoners and merchants with the indigenous tribes along the southern path facilitated a transfer of wealth to the frontiers. Throughout history, the Northern Silk Road was frequently severed by the shifting sands of Central Asian politics or the rise of the Xiongnu and Turkic Khaganates. Yet the Southern Silk Road, rooted in the organic needs of the people and anchored by more stable terrain, displayed incredible resilience. For centuries, while northern paths were choked by war, the southern caravans continued their arduous trek through toxic mists and dense jungles. They carried more than just goods. They carried scripts, calendars, and medical knowledge. This grassroots, bottom-up vitality made the Southern Silk Road a perpetual engine of exchange between China, Southeast Asia, India, and ultimately Western Asia. It was the geographic precursor to the ancient Tea-Horse Road and China's most vital economic artery to the Indian Ocean before the Age of Discovery. From China to Iran, from Chang'an to Nisa, the twin Silk Roads of the Han Dynasty were more than just trade lines connecting East and West 2 millennia ago. They were a heroic odyssey of humanity, overcoming the geographical abyss in pursuit of civilizational dialogue. They proved that even in the era of the Qin and Han, when productivity was severely limited, Eastern civilization was never satisfied with inward-looking autarky. Instead, it always harbored a profound curiosity for the unknown, taking brave steps toward the West and the glistening sea. It teaches us that true civilizational exchange does not always begin with the grand ambitions of kings. It can start with the simplest of desires, a beautiful piece of silk or a sturdy bamboo staff. It is these small, persistent hungers that ultimately wove the grand network covering the Eurasian continent. Today, As we re-examine this ancient journey from China to Iran, we hear more than just the echoes of history. That primal drive to cross mountains and rivers in search of a better life and to understand a distant civilization still flows through the veins of modern society. 2,000 years later, as we observe China's energy pipelines and transcontinental railways, we see that the hunger to find an outlet to the sea from the deep interior, to find strategic depth, has never changed. The backward glance of that Han envoy in the markets of Bactria was, in fact, a prophecy of the integration of Eurasia we see today.